If you're not breathing correctly, you're never, ever going to be healthy. These methods can have an incredible impact on both mental health and physical health. Some things that scientists thought were absolutely impossible have been proven to be absolutely possible by focusing on your breathing. It's hard to see someone who hasn't had a very profound reaction after 20 minutes says, wow, I feel so good.
We can almost induce a feeling of anxiety and panic by changing the way that we breathe.
Of course we can. And if anyone wants to do that, you can start breathing in this very unhealthy way right now. You will stimulate a sympathetic response, and that's easily measured. So I thought this was interesting as well. At UCSF, which is very close to my house, University of California, San Francisco, Dr. Margaret Chesney had worked for decades on National Institutes of Health research looking into something called continuous partial awareness, also known as email apnea. And what she had found was that when we sit down at our desks in the morning, one estimate says that 80% of office workers do this. We open up our email, got Zoom on, got Twitter on. Oh my God, I have 60 emails. We stop breathing. We just stop breathing and then we go. So she called it email apnea because we're so distracted and stressed out by what's going on. If you think about when you're extremely, let's say there's a tiger coming around the corner here of my house. What am I going to do? I'm going to be silent because that is a reflex reaction to be very scared, to be silent so you don't become prey. And once it's on, once the fight is on, I'm going to breathe a ton to get more energy to my body, to feed more energy to my brain and heart and other essential muscles to get me out of that situation or to fight off that thing. But we do the same thing unconsciously at work. Even though there's no tiger around, even though there's nothing threatening us, our sense of threat has become so sensitized that so many of us will stop breathing or start breathing completely dysfunctional. And she's found that if you do this for long enough, it can have some of the same effects on us as sleep apnea. By that, I mean neurological disorders, physical problems, again, spiking blood glucose, adrenaline. And it's just something so few of us are aware of. And I was wearing a pulse ox and all these different measuring what happened. Every morning I put this stuff on and sit down. My breathing would go to hell every single morning. And I realized that, that's probably a reason why around 11:30 I used to get the slight headache, used to feel kind of fatigued. It was still morning time and I wasn't full of energy. And so by just switching your breathing, again, you can allow your body to work so much more efficiently.
Yeah, I mean, thanks for sharing that. And I think that term email apnea is brilliant because it just brings it to life for people that, wow, who doesn't check email every day? Who doesn't spend a lot of time on their computers, particularly now more than ever? And I really, I can't stop shaking the feeling. You mentioned the tiger, right? That might be popping around the block in San Francisco, around from where you live. Which I hope is not happening, but your body's actually doing what it's meant to do in response to a threat. Your body is meant to become anxious. It's meant to become hypervigilant. Your blood sugar's meant to go up, right? Your blood pressure's meant to go up. All these things are happening to prepare you for danger so that you can escape from that danger. So actually, your body is functioning the way it is designed to function, given the fact that it perceives that to be a threat. So the problem is that we're perceiving the email inbox or the multiple screens open to be a threat. So your body is reacting in the same way. So it's not that there's anything wrong with people, right? I think it's very empowering this. Your body's not broken. Actually, your body's doing what it's meant to do. You just got to give it a different signal. You've got to just teach it, go, hey, you know what? I'm not in danger. There isn't a tiger there. It's just 20 emails. Right. So I'm a big fan of talking to patients about transition times. So a transition time, let's say from work to home life, instead of just coming all ramped up from work into then trying to relax with your partner and your children, maybe have a 5-minute transition where you do some breathing or you do some yoga, something just to move you, shift you from one gear to the other gear. And I've been talking to a lot of people, particularly during the pandemic, about Zoom calls. I said, before you eat your lunch, just take a couple of minutes, maybe get outside in the garden if you're lucky to have one, maybe to slow down your breathing, do 2 minutes of nasal breathing, put your body in a different state, and you'll digest your food better. You'll crave different amounts. And I've actually seen, James, I'm not sure if you've come across this. I've not seen any research to support this, but I have seen with some patients in the last few years who thought they were reacting to a certain food. Now, of course, some people do react to certain foods, whether an intolerance or an allergy, but sometimes I realized they were reacting to the way that their body was whilst they were eating. So when they did a couple of minutes, I have a breath called the 3-4-5 breath, which I've been recommending for many years. Again, a similar theme, right? A longer exhale than an inhale. But people who try that 3-4-5 breath for 2 minutes before they have their dinner, sometimes they would say, hey, I'm not actually reacting to that food anymore. So I am saying, well, maybe it's about that you're eating in a completely stressed out state. Your body's not able to receive that food. But when you chill out and relax, your body's like, hey, this food is okay.
Absolutely right. Again, it comes down to nature. And I thought you made a really good point there. There's nothing wrong with us feeding more circulation to our skeletal muscles when we get threatened. This is really good. This is what allowed our species to survive in the wild for so long. It's that perceived danger and that perceived threat that is so sensitized right now that people will react to an email the same way that they would have reacted 1,000 years ago to that tiger or to being attacked by a mammoth or whatever. And so, a lot of this is psychological, but the neat thing about breathing is by changing the way in which you breathe, you can actually change how your mind is processing thoughts and feelings and emotions. And we know that because this is a two-way street. So there are signals coming from your brain telling your organs what to do, but there are also signals coming from your organs telling your brain what to do. So another reason why that slower breathing works, you're like, I can actually, not only do I feel better, I can think more clearly. Not a placebo. This is how it works in our bodies. And it's so important to acknowledge this throughout the day. Those transition times, what a wonderful thing to do, especially before a meal, especially if you have gut issues. Take a couple minutes, that's not asking a lot, breathe calmly, relax yourself, and go in and eat. And I think that you'd be amazed by how quickly you will show benefits of digestion. I don't think it's too much of a mystery why in so many cultures there's grace before a meal.
Right.
You sit down, you calmly recite whatever phrase, doesn't matter what religion. You sit there a moment, you be thankful for the food you're about to eat, then you eat it. I think that there is a scientific foundation for how effective that is.
I completely agree. And actually, a few weeks ago, I finished writing my 4th book on weight loss for people who are looking to lose weight. And I've written a section on this exact area, exactly what you say, that actually, I don't think this is by accident. There are many benefits of doing this. And it's reflective of our busy modern culture. We don't have time for this kind of stuff. We've evolved as humans. We don't need all that kind of slow stuff, that gratitude, that grace. But you know what? We're realizing more than ever now, actually, we are. As you say, it's a lost art. It's a lost art.
Just speaking to that, this 5.5 breaths a minute, 5.5 second inhale, exhale, this is nothing new either. This was all adapted, researchers found, from prayers, from Buddhist prayers, from Kundalini yoga prayers, from Catholic prayers. All of them that they looked at locked in to this respiration rate of about 5.5 seconds. And these Italian researchers said, this is probably no coincidence. All these different cultures came to the same conclusion that, wow, we feel so much more connected to ourselves, to the universe, to everything by reciting this prayer. A lot of that had to do, this is what the researchers said, to the respiration rate. to breathing in this certain way to calm your body and make you more receptive to that message.
Yeah, thanks, James. I was chatting to my videographer, Gareth, who's just nipped out at the moment. And I was saying, hey, I'm going to talk to James. I know since you heard my chats with Patrick and Brian, he's changed his life. You know, he's tried the mouth taping at night. He sleeps better. He now runs. He does some light jogging, only nasal breathing, and really feeling the benefits. But he said one thing I wonder if you could ask James about is he says, when I go upstairs now, if I go up a lot of stairs and I nasal breathe, my recovery is so much quicker than when I mouth breathe. But you've already answered that, really. You said that throughout this conversation. You're basically saying your physiology changes. It works more optimally when we breathe through our nose as opposed to our mouth. But there is another kind of real life example. This was minutes before we started the call today. He said, you know, it's just incredible. And you mentioned athletes, and I just wonder if you could briefly, I mean, the time that we've got left, I'd love to cover this, and also maybe some of those more super breathing techniques. So we could just cover athletics and kind of recovery and why people really should make that effort. I think it would be super helpful.
So the key with athletic performance is you want to do more for longer in a state of pure efficiency. And we know that nasal breathing is going to allow you to perform harder with a lower heart rate. You're going to be getting more oxygen more efficiently by breathing less. Again, we know how counterintuitive this is, but the science is very clear on that. And you can see this with professional athletes who have adopted to nasal breathing. Sanya Richards-Ross, the best runner, sprinter for 10 years going. It's fascinating to look at pictures of her in the Olympics. Closed mouth, nasal breathing, all of her competitors beside her, breathing through the mouth. She's in front of the line, winning golds time and time again. And she's just one example of what we've already known for decades. Dr. John Douillard has done tons of science, tons of work in this, looking at cyclists, nasal breathing versus mouth breathing, and looking at their endurance, looking at their performance, and looking at recovery. And it is such a drastic difference between those two. One reason why a lot of people give up is they try nasal breathing. They've been habitually mouth breathing while they're jogging for sometimes decades. They try nasal breathing and they're like, I can't get enough air in there. I'm giving up. But sometimes it can take weeks or even months to truly acclimate this organ here to breathe properly. But once you do, the benefits are huge. And check out the work by Phil Maffetone, Dr. John Douillard, and some of the athletes that have adopted proper nasal breathing. Or try, most importantly, try it yourself. And you can very clearly see the difference.
I would say to people, because I've literally been experimenting this for maybe 12, 18 months now. You know, when I go for a walk, I'm nasal breathing. Like it's, you know, no question, I will make sure. I don't think about it now because I know I do it. But initially I had to, you know, consciously think about it. I do, you know, I take the kids for walks. We're all sort of trying to spot if one of us is mouth breathing. So I'm trying to instill it in my kids from a young age that this is important. Actually, I went for a run with my son yesterday. He's like, Daddy, look, that guy's running, he's mouth breathing. That guy's mouth breathing. I'm like, I'm sort of conflicted. Have I started something in him? I'm not sure. But on one level, I like it because I think, okay, as you said before, awareness is key, right? Without awareness, we can't make any change. So first of all, let's be aware of what's happening. Let's not beat ourselves up. Be aware. Then let's go, well, maybe I'll start with a walk. Maybe a 5-minute walk each day, nasal breathing, and see how you go. And for me personally, now I sort of am getting into running. I was going to buy a heart rate monitor. And I thought, you know what? Forget it. I sort of don't want more and more tech in my life. I'm trying to sort of go more minimalist. And I use nasal breathing as my barometer. As soon as I go too fast, where I cannot nasal breathe and I have to open my mouth, that's my trigger to slow down. And I really feel I'm getting more efficient, and it feels really good. And you know what? I'm not stiff the next day or that evening. I recover quickly. Again, I will admit this is a subjective experience, but it backs up the data and the science that you've written about so beautifully in your book.
But exactly, it may be a subjective experience, but it's grounded in real science. If you look at nasal breathing and you look at using that oxygen most efficiently, you are allowing your body to operate in an aerobic state for longer than to go anaerobic and have that lactic acid build up and all of that. And this is very well known, having that balance again of CO2 and oxygen. And something that Patrick McEwen told me, which I really liked, he said, never work out harder than you can breathe correctly. So once you've reached that threshold and you're breathing, you're like, I really got to breathe through my mouth, or you're breathing in a dysfunctional way, you have to slow down and work yourself back up. And by slowly working yourself up this way, your performance is just going to shoot through the roof. And we've seen that time and time again. And again, these weren't studies that I was doing. These are studies that have been around for decades, that right now there's this new interest in breathing in athletics. And I have a feeling these people who are going to be adopting these healthy breathing habits are just going to show some incredible improvements.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And it's again, it's just reflective of culture. It's the more now, we're quicker, faster. It's like, I'm going to work out, I want to push it hard. I'm going to be grunting. I'm going to be, I wouldn't, is it a Western thing? I guess it is on some level. I really feel we're at that point now in Western culture where we have to go, look, we do so many things beautifully well, but we're kind of a bit lost on some of these other things, and maybe just slowing down and doing less. When we, in inverted commas, work out or move our bodies, maybe use your nose as the barometer, and then, you'll be working on your efficiency. Maybe you'll run less, but you'll run more efficiently, which actually will lead to you running more just a few months down the line.
Yeah, it still ties. There's nothing wrong with running further and running faster than a competitor, right? That's human nature to want to do that. But if you really want to do that, you have to take control of the systems in your body, and you have to be operating more efficiently. Why waste energy? Like, why not store that energy, then use it to best your competitor? That's what sports performance is all about. And something you mentioned that I thought was interesting is, in so many ways, like what we know about eating now, food. I remember in the 80s, growing up in the 80s, just the only things that were around the house were just like processed food. This was normal: white bread, Velveeta cheese, and everyone seemed to be eating this way. Well, we know that eating that stuff is bad news. I'd be hard pressed to find someone who is going to defend eating highly processed foods. It's bad news. It took us a while to get to this point, right? So it took about maybe 20 years of science to come out. Now we all know it. And I really think breathing is this next thing. So 20 years ago, even nowadays, some people are poo-pooing it and say, how we breathe doesn't matter. The science is so clear. And you can go back in history thousands of years again, and they had been studying this for so long. And it really feels like this wave of awareness is really starting to crash right now.
No, I would agree, James. So just for the sort of final stage of this conversation then, we've just to sort of really put it in perspective, we're setting the scene that people are breathing too much, they're breathing too fast. And it's not necessarily how, of course, breathing when you're working out and running, sure, work on it if you want to. But again, if you want to do a sprint, you want to breathe through your mouth to beat an opponent, that's okay. It's what we're talking about is how do you habitually breathe, right? So, because I know there's some confusion. So just to clarify, so what you're saying, I think, and certainly what I would say is practice breathing through your nose. Practice for a few minutes a day, breathing less. Try and go for that 6 or even 8 breaths a minute. See how that feels. Now, if you want to go beyond that, if you want to go into super breathing territory, right? The cool stuff that people get, oh, you know what? I want to do a marathon up Everest like Wim Hof or which again appeals to us culture of doing more, and I want to do all that crazy stuff. There are quite a few different methods on there where we consciously overbreathe. So you were talking about under breathing. Now I want to talk about, Wim Hof, the breathing technique, or one of his breathing techniques, certainly the one that I've experienced when I saw him speak in LA a few years ago. And I recorded a podcast with him a few weeks back. It's not come out yet. And we actually did it where you actually, for 30 or 40 breaths, you take these big breaths in and out, and then you do a hold. What is that doing? Why should people think about these over-breathing practices? Did you try them as part of your research? Did you look into the research here? And what would you tell people about these practices for those who are interested?
Sure. So the first thing, I just have to second something that you said. I'm talking about mouth breathing as a habit. Some people have written me and said, I noticed I was laughing today and I took a few mouth breaths. And again, I'm like, I thought I had made this very clear in the book. So I've been breathing through my mouth talking to you today, right? And when I swim in the ocean, I'm breathing through my mouth. When I'm laughing, I'm breathing through my mouth. This is perfectly fine and perfectly natural. So a few hundred breaths per day, breathing through the mouth, is fine. If we're taking 25,000, it's about that habit and that chronic breathing. You want to be breathing through your nose as often as you can, but that doesn't mean you should hate yourself for laughing or for breathing through your mouth. So I just want to make that really, really clear for everyone.
Or swimmers, right? Swimmers, like, you know, when you're swimming, you sort of have to take it. You don't have to, but you may gulp in a lot of water unless you breathe in through your mouth. So it can be normal for swimming. It can be fine, you know.
I swim and surf almost every day out here in San Francisco. And I'll tell you, I'm not breathing through my nose when I'm doing that. It's impossible. There's salt water up there. And there's nothing wrong with that.
Exactly.
It's chronic, it's habit. So in the book, after like you get that foundation of healthy breathing that everyone can benefit from, I kept hearing about Wim Hof breathing, these intense pranayamas, holotropic breath work, these long breath holds. I said, this is completely counter to what I learned before. We shouldn't, like, apnea is a bad thing. Overbreathing's a bad thing. All of that is true when it's unconscious. But when you consciously do it, when you place yourself into a position in which you tell yourself to follow with this ancient breathing technique, and some of these include mouth breathing, exhaling through the mouth or even inhaling through the mouth, something amazing happens because you're allowing yourself to consciously take control of unconscious functions in your body. So with Wim specifically, what I thought was so interesting is we have this autonomic nervous system that turns us on for sympathetic stress or turns us off and relaxes us, parasympathetic. And we've been told if you pick up a textbook, it's going to say this is autonomic, as in automatic, as in beyond our conscious control. But we can control it through breathing. And when we control our nervous system function, we can take control of our immune system functions as well. And we've seen this, people who have been practicing Wim's version, which he calls it Wim Hof method, but he's very clear that this stuff has been around for at least 1,000 years. He didn't invent anything. He was able to take this thing and distribute it to the masses. And he's done that better than anyone on the planet for breathing awareness. But it's no coincidence that the people who practice this, people with autoimmune diseases, with arthritis, eczema, psoriasis, whatever, they can show a marked decrease in the symptoms of their problems. And sometimes they claim that they're completely healed by adopting these simple breathing habits, because what they're doing is they're breathing in a way that purposely stresses themselves out for a short amount of time so that they could spend the rest of the day relaxing and healing themselves. Again, seems a little counterintuitive. Why would I purposely want to stress myself out if I'm stressed out throughout the rest of the day? The point is to focus that and to regain a balance in your body and in your health. And that's exactly what these more intense over-breathing practices do.
I think what you said there about where this has come from, that nobody new's invented anything, you know, Wim hasn't. These are all practices that have been there. But you also paid homage to Wim. He's got it out there to the masses in a fantastic way. You've said that, you know, that in the Indus Valley 5,000 years ago, there's writings on this and that. You actually, I think you wrote about that yoga, or the research, the scriptures you saw showed yoga initially was just a breathing practice. I think
that's exactly true.
Is that true?
There were no standing poses. There was no movement. It was focusing, meditating, and breathing. Only in the last 100 years have we developed vinyasa flow. That wasn't around until 100 years ago. And I want to make this very clear to all the yogis out there. I do yoga all the time. Love it. I've seen the benefits. There's science proving the benefits. But this practice, this modern yoga that most of us do, is just that. It's modern. So the first yoga was a practice of breathing and focusing, and then it developed into holding one pose and breathing, opening up this side, inhaling into that lung, opening up the other side. And then about 100 years ago, 110 years ago, those poses were combined into this sort of dance-like movement, which had nothing to do with the early yoga. So it really was all based on breathing and focusing on the breath.
Yeah, amazing. And one of the, I think you quote someone in the book, I can't remember who it was, but someone said to you, there are as many breath practices as there are diets. I've never heard that before. I thought that was incredible, because we talk about conscious over breathing, and if we had more time, I would talk about two-mode breathing and holotropic breathing. But you know what? It's all there in your book for people to read about. But that is, who said that phrase? Who was it?
A freediver told me that very early on, which I thought was very surprising. I didn't know that there were different ways of breathing. This was years and years ago. But by adopting those different breathing practices, you can push your body into different states. You can relax yourself on purpose. You can stress yourself out on purpose, which has pronounced benefits to doing that as well. And again, you can find books. There's yoga books with 400 different breathing practices with all of these crazy names. All of that's great, but I wanted to focus on the general concept behind these. There are heavy breathing practices, over breathing. There's breath holding, there's slow breathing, and there's nasal breathing. And you can call it whatever you want. You can practice the Chinese version of that, the Greek version of that, the Indian version of that. Doesn't matter, because they're really all doing the same thing. To me, it's no coincidence that Wim Hof method, also known as Tumo, has so many of the same benefits of Sudarshan Kriya, which has been studied in 60 different independent studies to help people with anxiety, depression, autoimmune problems. There's no coincidence that these things are helping people in the same way, because guess what? They have you breathe really intensely and then breathe really slowly. It's almost the exact same practice, just coming in from different directions.
Absolutely. Before we wrap up, you mentioned freediving, and I know you wrote a book on that. I haven't read it yet, and I am definitely, it's on right at the top of my list to sort of read when I get some time. But one question I had about freedivers who obviously have masterful control of their breath. Did you notice, was there a theme that, a freediver by definition needs to have a very high level of control over their breath, a high degree of carbon dioxide tolerance, so they can actually go down and actually maintain that, tolerate the buildup of carbon dioxide in their body without having that strong urge to breathe. Given the multiple benefits of improving your breathing, have you heard any stories in freedivers that actually a lot of them had mental health problems or depression or anxiety or autoimmune conditions that got better? Or the flip side is, was it those conditions that actually led them to freediving in the first place? I don't know, it's so interesting for me, that.
Many of them had anxiety issues, sometimes depression issues, sometimes addiction issues. There's a great film that somebody made, a very short film, Jonathan Rempel, about a freediver who had all of those things. And she found freediving because when you freedive, you are it is almost like a forced meditation. You cannot freedive stressed out. You cannot freedive with anxiety. You cannot freedive with a sense of panic. You have to completely give yourself over to the water and connect so deeply in your body. And when you're down there, everything is silent. So you are so connected with your breath and with your brain on such an intimate level. And this reconnects people with themselves when they're up on dry land afterwards. And so some people have found that salvation through freediving, and so much of that is due to breath control. So I've never seen, I've met dozens and dozens of freedivers. That book, Deep, looked at the ocean from the surface to the very bottom of the sea, looking at the human connection. So towards the surface, there was a lot of freediving, but I've never seen one who suffered from anxiety. I've never seen one who panicked, because you just can't do that when you're down deep in the water holding your breath. There hasn't been any studies on this. I think it would be fascinating to look at the physiology of someone before and after training for freediving, look at markers of panic, look at other issues, even blood glucose, and how they react. Because freediving is the ultimate art of breathing. You are focused on your breath, connected to your breath the whole time.
Breath, it's mindfulness, it's meditation, it's everything all in one, right? To be able to do that practice. And one study that we've not had a chance to talk about, which I've underlined heavily in my book, and I'd encourage people to read it in the book, is it's just this idea of fear. And that lady who had that genetic condition without the amygdala, this sort of emotional center, the fear center of the brain, and how basically you can't stress her out. She would get scared of nothing until carbon dioxide went into her. She got a dose of carbon dioxide, and that then stressed her out and scared her. I won't sort of spoil the rest of the story there for people, but what's really incredible for that, and I really want people to get this, is that we think fear and anxiety is always about an external event. Oh, that is happening to us. We forget that it can be biology, it can be physiology. And I know how many people suffer from these sort of conditions, and I really, really want to encourage them that what James has been talking about, read the book, learn about these techniques, and start small, because it can really transform every aspect of your life. James, look, I don't say this often, but that is a phenomenal book. I feel quite lucky, actually. I've got these early copies, still very sort of the early unproofed manuscripts. So I feel I've got sort of something quite special here. The podcast is called Feel Better, Live More, because, James, it's pretty obvious, but fundamentally, I've seen time and time again where people feel better in themselves, they get more out of their lives. And I think it's pretty clear that you're making the case that if we breathe better, we're going to live more. So I wonder if, I want people to get inspired by this. I want them to get your book, but I want people to take action. I don't want them just to hear it and go, that was interesting, and then get on with their lives. So I always like to leave the podcast with my guests with some sort of practical advice. I know you've covered a lot of it already, but just some sort of, what would you say? If someone's heard this and are still skeptical, how would you encourage them to get going with a breathwork practice in their daily lives?
I would say go see for yourself, because you're your best judge of this. If you have a blood pressure monitor, and a lot of people do, take your blood pressure before and after a simple breathing practice 6 times a minute. You could start with that. Start small, exactly as you had said, and give it a while. By that, give it a week. So adopt a simple practice. And again, this isn't requiring you to go to a monastery or sit in a dark corner. You can adopt healthy breathing practices anywhere. And we know that there's a solid foundation of science between all of these things. We have seen people absolutely transform by adopting simple breathing habits. This is not a placebo effect. It's absolutely real. And I'm convinced, I've experienced this myself. I've talked to dozens and dozens of people who have also experienced it. I've talked to the leaders in the field who have introduced me to all of their data. And I find that this is an underappreciated and underacknowledged aspect of our health, but that's starting to change, and it couldn't happen sooner, especially right now in the midst of a pandemic. Focusing on your breathing can really have some transformative effects.
I think we're all walking around with this reservoir of untapped potential that we don't even know how good we could feel, how fit we could be, how well we could sleep, how much less stress we could feel in our lives if we found the right breathing technique for us that's going to suit, our lifestyle and the way we choose to live. And I thought a good place to really think about this is by talking about Swami Rama, who we didn't talk about last time, because I think he is really showing just how far you can go with this. And I'm not saying we all need to go that far, but I think it beautifully illustrates just what is possible when you really learn to harness the power of your breath.
Yeah, and before we get into Swami Rama, I just want to mention, pick up on one thing. We were just talking about kids, and we didn't mention this in the first chat either. But since the book has come out, and since you and I chatted, how many months ago was that? I've heard from so many sleep medicine researchers, people who specialize in pediatrics. And what I learned from them is that the pandemic of ADHD, about 10% of the population in the US suffers from ADHD. Most are kids from age 2 to 5, and then it picks up again from ages around 12 to 17. But most ADHD is tied directly to breathing and breathing quality. And they showed me the percentages of 75% of kids who have ADHD also have sleep disordered breathing. And by improving their breathing during the day and during the night, so many of these kids can overcome what is considered this psychological or neurological problem. And that has just blown me away, that simply breathing properly can have such a transformative effect. But then I was thinking about it more. I said, this shouldn't be shocking, because if you're doing something wrong throughout the day, and if you're doing something 100% wrong for a third of your life, it's going to destroy your body. And that's what we've been seeing with these kids with ADHD. And Dr. Stephen Park at Albert Einstein College of Medicine is doing some incredible work in this area as well, looking at what happens when you allow a kid to breathe better. Look at how quickly they're able to overcome some of these chronic issues. So I just wanted to tie that on before we talk about Swami Rama. But in many ways, I view that these things are related, because it just shows you the potential of what breathing can do, not only to heal us of some chronic issues, but to also put us up that next rung of human potential. And I think that old Mr. Rama did that better than anyone. This is to give a little backstory on him. This is somebody who grew up in the Himalayas, and he was taught yoga and breath work at the age of around 4.
Wow.
And he stuck with it his whole life, spent years in a cave honing this skill. And he got so good at it that by the time he was in his 30s, he went off and traveled the world. He studied at Oxford. He studied at various universities. He knew like 8 different languages. And he was so impressive that researchers at the Menninger Clinic, which at the time was the largest psychiatric training facility in the US and the most renowned, a Navy physicist there had heard about all these things he was able to do. In other tests, he apparently was able to stop his heart just by focusing on his mind and breath. And he was able to increase the temperature in his fingers. And this Navy physicist didn't believe these stories, even though the data was right there. So he brought Swami Rama into his facility and conducted a battery of tests. And they found that he was able to remain conscious while he lulled his brain into a delta state. So a delta state are the states of very deep sleep. We're supposed to be unconscious. We're supposed to be asleep. But he was able to remain conscious during these states. So that was pretty impressive. But what impressed them even more was that he was able to control his heart rate. He was able to increase it about 20 beats per minute within a space of about 8 seconds. And he was actually able to make it beat at a rate of more than 300 beats per minute with his mind. And he did this for more than a minute. That state, atrial fibrillation, is supposed to be, it will kill you after a while, but apparently Swami Rama could do this for about a half an hour to an hour. All of these things are medically impossible, and no one would believe it unless there was a real doctor there, researcher there, recording the whole thing. And still, this was reported in the New York Times. So it was reported in Time magazine. And still, I get letters from doctors that say, you should check your sources. This is obviously impossible. No one can do this. And, you know, how much more science do you need? But that has more to do with how people want to view the world than to actually look at data and numbers. So,
could he also change the temperature on his hand?
Yeah, I mean, there's a whole laundry list of things this guy could do. I didn't want to bore you with it, but in another experiment, since you asked, of course, he was able to take his hand and focus on his hand and turn one area gray from lack of blood flow and the other area bright red. And they went and they measured the temperature on the same hand, and it varied by 11 degrees. So not only could he take over entire organs like the heart and the brain, but he could take over specific parts of his body and pinpoint where he wanted to control his conscious energy. And a few people who had studied with Rama have written me, and they said, oh, you know, it was great to read that you were able to track down this research and track down these studies, but this was child's play to him. This was apparently nothing. And he's now passed away, but I am now currently trying to get a hold of some other people who have learned Rama's methods and who can do things that, according to them, I've not seen any of this, will really make what Rama did in these studies seem very insignificant. So, COVID has put a big fork in that, but things are starting to open up, and I'm hoping to go back out into the field and to record and write about more of this stuff.
I mean, it is interesting to hear the skepticism that will come back on these sort of extreme stories. You often get the skepticism around Wim Hof as well. It's still there, even though I think he's shown through a lot of science, a lot of real life people have adopted these and are writing and are sharing their experiences. So there's a lot of real world data out there as well. Yet there is that skepticism, and it really speaks to what I was thinking about today, which is this untapped reservoir of potential that we all have within us. You know, the body's pharmacy that we're not properly opening up and accessing. And I guess one of the reasons Wim has been so relatable to people is because, certainly in the Western world, I should be really clear, in the Western world, it's because, he kind of, the name Swami Rama, I guess, might put a block there for certain people. Oh, that doesn't apply to me. And of course he was, this guy was rocking meditation and breathwork at the age of 4, which is fantastic, in the Himalayas as well. So it answered this kind of romanticism and mystique that people then sort of feel, well, that's not relevant for me. I live in the middle of the city. I've got to, work 6 days a week. I've got to do this and take my kids to after school club. It seems quite distant. Whereas Wim, I think to some people at least, feels a lot more relatable. But they both speak to the potential there, because what you've just described Swami Rama doing, mind-blowing, incredible. But, Wim has also done some incredible stuff where people have injected endotoxin, which would make most people sick. And through his breath, through his controlling his immune system, he doesn't get sick. And I've been thinking about this theme recently, that yes, we want science, and I know we want science, and it's great to get the science to really give it that validation to spread the message. But it feels to me on some level that breathing is so fundamental to who we are as humans that there's almost a 3-dimensional quality to breathing. The life force, the energy it gives us. As soon as we stop breathing, we die. That actually, I wonder sometimes, do we look at it through a very sort of one-dimensional, reductionist, scientific lens? Whilst that has merit, I sometimes wonder if we're missing some of that broader picture that some, I guess, of these ancient practices may have been speaking about and talking about for many years?
Well, I think when it comes to people's apprehension, there's nothing much I can do about that. And the last thing I want to do is to become an evangelist. I really want to be even keeled here and just provide what I have found. You know, I'm
Yeah.
not the one doing the research here. I'm reporting, and there's a big difference in that. I think when you look at Wim Hof and Tumo, and I've gotten some blowback on this as well. I've had people say it is impossible for a human to sit in snow for 8 hours at a time and melt a circle around themselves without wearing any clothes. This is scientifically impossible. And then I'll send them the study done by Herbert Benson at Harvard Medical School that was published in Nature, the most esteemed scientific journal on the planet, that shows that people can do this with their breathing. And that's usually when I never hear back from these people again. And that's fine, right? So Wim has come up with the exact same resistance, but the difference is he's not wearing a robe. He's not wearing beads. He drinks beer, eats pasta, plays guitar, you know, just like every other middle-aged adult male. And so that has made him very approachable in many ways. He's also volunteered to do whatever study people want to do. And I think what he's discovered, especially with the study with the endotoxin, when they first shot Wim up with the endotoxin of E. coli, and he didn't suffer any symptoms, and they said, "Oh, you're just a weirdo. There's no way anyone else can do this." He's like, "Well, let me take a group of people that you can pick. I'm going to train them for 4 days, and then they're going to come back and do exactly what I did," which is exactly what happened. So I think that it's this kind of science in this accumulation of data, which is so necessary. You'll certainly get to a point where people just don't want to hear about it. If you look at climate change, how many studies are there showing climate change is real? Like 1,200, 1,300? And you still have people saying, I don't believe any of that stuff. What can you do about that? To me, you can just offer them information, right? And if they want to approach this in a scientific way with truly an open view, then they can do with that what they will and really look at the data. But when it comes to these superhuman feats of Swami Rama and Wim Hof, and even Chuck McGee has these to a certain extent, I don't view these as superhuman at all. These are human abilities that each and every one of us can hone. And when we hone them, we can maybe not be able to sit in snow for 8 hours at a time and melt a circle around us, but we can improve our health. And I think that is Wim's most impressive and important message. He's saying, don't go to Everest and run a half marathon in bare feet and bare chested like me. I already did that. But why don't you take control of your breath? And then once you take control of your breath, you can use that to help establish better healthy habits throughout the day. And I think that's why he's resonated with so many people across the globe, is because he's allowing them to use something that we are all born with, right? It's our own natural human body to improve our condition.
It's beyond health as well,
Yeah.
James. Everything we do in life, we're breathing whilst we're doing it. Right, we take our breath everywhere with us. It's no part of our life is lived separately to the breath, and therefore improving our breath has the potential to improve every aspect of our life. You mentioned health, but our relationships can be significantly improved, because if we can control our breath, we can breathe better, our stress levels will be lower, we deal with stress and friction much better. Your sleep quality can potentially be better. We spoke about that at the start, about nasal breathing at night. Yes, there's going to be an impact on chronic disease as well, but it is this three-dimensional kind of, this is sort of what I was getting at, that you don't live your life without your breath. So improving the quality of your breath absolutely can have profound benefits, whether you want to climb Everest in your shorts or whether you just want to get through the day better, calmer, more peace. And I guess that's why as a doctor, I'm so passionate about breathwork. In each of my 4 books, breathwork has come up in all of them, even though I write about different topics, because the breath is central to so many different aspects of our lives.
I learned this from a sleep researcher and biochemist. He said that we get most of our energy not through food, but through our breath. So if you look at how glucose is broken down, it takes 6 times more oxygen than glucose to fuel us. And he broke down the whole chemical structure of how that works with oxidative phosphorylation. And he said, so if you explain to people that, all of the food that they're focusing on every minute of the day, all of the supplements, yes, food is incredibly important for health and for energy. Of course it is. But that food can't do any of its magic if you don't have the breath there as well, if you don't have that proper and efficient supply of oxygen. So just as you mentioned, this is not woo-woo new age stuff. This is the most basic biochemistry in the human body. And breathing has to be considered as important as what we eat and how much we exercise and how well we sleep. It really does. And I think it's starting to. I think it's been pushed to the background for a little while now, but people are starting to recognize it. And just concerning how the human body is able to function better with breathing and what happens when we put the body in a state of nature. There's a quote by Albert Svent-Georgi, who won the Nobel Prize for his work in vitamin C, that I love. And as you were talking, I was just reminded of this quote. He said, "More than 60 years of research on living systems has convinced me that our body is much more nearly perfect than the endless list of ailments suggests. Its shortcomings are due less to its inborn imperfections than to our abusing it." That's pretty wordy, but what he's saying is the further we put ourselves away from nature, the sicker we're going to get. And the more we return to the state in which we naturally evolved, the better we can get. And breathing, again, is a huge part of that. Returning your breathing to the way your ancestors used to breathe. Not superhuman breathing, not super turbo breathing. Just regular, natural human breathing is all you need. Follow your ancestors as the guide, or any of the other 5,400 different mammals in the wild right now. And that, to me, is really the best teacher as far as breathing is concerned.
To breathe well and to breathe optimally, we need a certain physical structure. We need a certain posture. We need to be able to get into certain positions. And I've read somewhere in your work, James, that 30% of breathing is dictated by posture. Yet we're living in a society where many people have got rounded backs, sort of craned out necks. There's many reasons for that: sedentary jobs, smartphones, laptops, whatever it is. But how does this play a role in our ability to breathe? Because some people will be hearing this and go, "Okay, James, you convinced me. I'm in. I want to breathe better. I want to get your book. I want to check out the techniques. I want to find the right one for me." But where does posture play a role, and what can people do about that?
Well, if you consider that in your chest right now are these 2 huge balloons, right? These are your lungs. And these balloons need to inflate properly and deflate for you to get a consistent and easy flow of air. And by getting that consistent and easy flow of air, you will be able to consistently and easily get a flow of oxygen, which is what is going to fuel all of your cells. So when we're sitting like this, hunched over, which is how I sit a lot, or if we're sitting on a couch with our feet up, and if we're walking around with our shoulders like this, even if we wanted to take a full and easy breath, we can't, because we can't inflate those two balloons in our chest, those two lungs. So Dr. Belisa Vranic has done some amazing work in the biomechanics of breathing. And I talked with her recently and read her books, and they're fantastic if you're looking at the biomechanics of breathing. And she has found that most of us tend to breathe up and down, right? But what we should really be doing is to be breathing out and in. Because what you want to do is you want to be engaging the diaphragm and inhaling the lungs, air into the lungs very softly. So in order to do that, your rib cage needs to be flexible, right? And if you think about what yoga does, what is yoga more than just a way of stretching your rib cage and your intercostals so that you can breathe more easily? So Vranic has this test. It's called the Bic Test. And what you do is you place your hands and you put them above your hip bones and you breathe in, and you want to feel your hands moving out laterally, not just your stomach going out. That's where a lot of people get it wrong. Like they think belly breathing is about pushing the stomach out. You want your belly around here to expand outward and inward. And if you can do that, then you're breathing correctly. If you can't and you feel no movement there, then you're an up and down breather. And the more you focus on this, on breathing out and in, the more you start to feel your diaphragm descending in the proper way. And the more you start being able to breathe more easily. This has made an incredible difference for me in my understanding of breathing. Not only that, but also in athletic performance, whether I'm surfing or running or whatever, to focus on breathing outward and inward instead of up and down.
Yeah, it's incredible. And it's, I guess, what you're showcasing there is that it doesn't matter if your posture's a bit altered from years of not breathing well and being hunched over. I guess the positive note is there's things you can do once you now flip that switch in your brain and say, right, okay, I'm going to take breath seriously. I'm going to start working on certain things. I'm going to every day just try that and just see if I can get a bit more expansion out rather than up and down. I really think people are going to start to feel those differences. And as I said earlier in our conversation, they're going to start tuning into things that they weren't even aware of before. You know, I said, James, that I'm training for the London Marathon in October, and I was actually challenged by a radio DJ last year to do it live on air, and I said yes. It was due to be in 12 weeks at that time, and I wasn't a runner. But because of COVID and the restrictions, it's been delayed. It's now meant to be happening this October. Now, at the time, I was having some hamstring issues, and I was put in touch with one of the best movement therapists I've ever come across, and I've dealt with many over the course of my career. And she's got this machine. There's only 3 of them in the world. She's got these machines where they can literally measure every bone in your body as you're running and see the positioning. And she just uses that as a tool. But what's interesting is that we do lots of things together, and it's been transformative for me in my running, but also in my breathing. And once we did this thing where my spine, all the bones in my spine, one of the big problems for me is that they always face right. They never come around to the midline and go to the left. This is something you really wouldn't know until you'd been on a machine like this and you can actually see. And then a lot of my issues start to make a lot of sense. And she gave me this gorgeous spiral breathing exercise to do that took about 3 minutes. We did it together. I felt totally open and my ribs expanded afterwards. So we went back on the machine. No word of a lie. Everything came back online and my spine is now going right. And then when I went, it's going all the way to the left. It's like, I said, Helen, that has completely changed. And all I've done is 3 minutes of breath work. She goes, yeah, I see this all the time. It's because once we can get this working better, I don't want to oversimplify what she does. Once the diaphragm's working better, more efficiently, it affects everything around it. It affects your spine. And I guess I'm just sharing that with you because, again, that is N=1. That is just my own experience, but super, super powerful. So I do that 3 minute spiral breathing exercise every day. I don't need any more motivation now because I've seen firsthand that my gaits, my biomechanics change simply on the back of it.
So this once again reminds me of another ancient quote I'm going to bore you with. That's about 1400.
I'm loving these quotes, man. Loving them.
So this one I think speaks to exactly what you just said. It says, what the bodily form depends on is breath, and what breath relies upon is form. When the breath is perfect, the form is perfect too. So if you are hesitant to think that your breathing may impact your posture, just consider those huge 6 liters of air, those 2 balloons in your body, and just take a deep breath and feel what happens to your posture when you take a deep breath, and feel what happens to your spine. I was talking to Dr. Andrew Weil about this, and he had learned from a doctor early on in his studies. He's a famous American doctor. I'm not sure if he's made it across the pond here. But he said, just look at scoliosis. So this is the sideways curvature of the spine. It comes on right before puberty and throughout puberty. And we still don't know what causes scoliosis. Sometimes MS can definitely influence it, and other diseases can influence it. But for the mass majority of people who have scoliosis, we don't know what causes it. How strange is that? So many people have this, and we still don't know why they have it. So he was convinced from the doctor that he talked to that this starts early on when dysfunctional breathing is present. When people tend to be turned like this too much, and tend to keep breathing into the right lung, or tend to keep breathing into their left lung while they're sleeping, while they're awake, while they're playing. Just like you, I tend to be a left side person. That's where my posture is. Whenever I get my spine cracked and fixed, they say, every single person tells me that. They're like, why are you leaning to the left so much? I don't know. It's just one of those things. So an extreme version of what you and I are both doing is scoliosis. So when someone has this dysfunctional breathing, again, this is so hypothetical. You can't run a randomized controlled study of this, and no one ever should. But just as a thought experiment, I thought that that was interesting. And then I researched the work by Katharina Schroth, who was a teenager living in Dresden, Germany at the beginning of the 1900s. She had scoliosis. It was very bad. She was given, a brace and a wheelchair and told that this is what you're going to do the rest of your life. You're going to be in this brace. And she realized that she had 2 lungs, and these acted like balloons, and that when you place something around a balloon and inflate it, whatever is around it will take that form. So she developed something called orthopedic breathing, where she would breathe into one lung and exhale, breathe into the other lung and exhale. And she actually breathed her spine straight, and went and taught this to thousands and thousands of women. It's still being used at Johns Hopkins University. The pictures are there. The studies are there. And it's still interesting that so many people with scoliosis now are completely unaware of how just breathing and stretching can have a really profound effect on posture. And for those of us lucky enough not to have scoliosis, how you breathe vastly affects your posture. If you're breathing unhealthy, it's going to affect your posture. If you're breathing healthy, that's going to improve your posture. And the proof is all over the place.
Breathing better, being able to use our diaphragm more fully, breathing out and in rather than just up and down. These things will have an impact on our lung capacity. And of course, lung capacity, better lung capacity is going to make you fitter if you're an athlete, or certainly give you a better ability to go harder for longer. But I think lung capacity also really has benefits for us beyond fitness, for health, well-being, day-to-day health and well-being, but also longevity. Can you speak a little bit around lung capacity and just how important that is?
Sure. So larger lungs for athletes is a bigger gas tank. They can go longer without having to fill up. So obviously that's going to affect their performance, and it's also going to affect their recovery, as we were talking about earlier. But just having larger and healthier lungs has been discovered to have a profound effect on lifespan. And I found this in the Framingham study, which is the 70-year-long longitudinal study focused on heart health. But what they found was that the most significant and accurate marker of lifespan wasn't genetics or exactly what we were eating. It was lung size and lung function. And they found this with a study of more than 5,200 people. The more quickly our lungs deteriorated, the more quickly we lost that lung capacity, the sooner we would die. And the better our lungs function, the bigger they were, the longer we would live. So there's been various studies done that have found the exact same results as the Framingham study. I even found one study with something like 800, they looked at 800 people who had lung transplants, and they found that people who had been transplanted, larger lungs lived much longer lives. So no matter how we get these large lungs, healthy lungs, they're going to benefit us. They're going to benefit our performance. They're going to just benefit our health in general. Luckily, we don't need to go out and get larger lungs surgically implanted in our bodies. We can just breathe healthy, stretch, and exercise. And by doing those things, we can not only stave off the entropy of lung capacity. What happens after the age of about 30, we lose lung capacity. Every decade, it really drops off precipitously once we get into our 60s and 70s. We can reverse that, and we can keep the same lung capacity and same lung function at the time when we need it most, and that's when we're older. We take in 30 pounds of air into our lungs and out of our lungs every single day. So if you think that that air and how we take that air in and how we expel it doesn't affect us, it's crazy. So much more than food. And in my opinion, after talking to researchers for so many years, you can eat all the right foods. You can eat paleo or keto or vegan or whatever. You can exercise as much as you want. But if you're not breathing correctly, you're never, ever going to be healthy. And I've seen this repeatedly with people who look to be the most fit people on the planet, and they have chronic respiratory problems, and they suffer from that in numerous ways. So once we take control of this unconscious ability to breathe, we can then harness all of the power within that and use it to do some incredible things. Some things that scientists thought were absolutely impossible have been proven to be absolutely possible by focusing on your breathing.
Yeah, well, we're going to delve into that during this conversation today, because there are so many fascinating stories that you've written about, research, case studies, really quite incredible. And there's you've done so many interviews since this book came out, and it is great for me as a medical doctor to see that there appears to be a huge amount of interest now, with books like yours, really raising awareness of how important the way we breathe is. But I was really struck by your subtitle in the book. And so the book's called Breath, but then the subtitle is The New Science of a Lost Art. Now, not only does that sound amazing, there's a real magic there. The new science of a lost art. Science and art fascinates me because I say the practice of medicine is art and science. It's not just science. It's not just looking at publications. It's how do you put that all together with the person in front of you, the patient in front of you, and how do you sort of blend it together to come up with the right solution for the right patient? So tell me about that subtitle in the context of the breath. Why is it a lost art?
Well, what I kept finding as I researched breathing, the art of breathing, starting from the last century to the century before that, and going back thousands of years, is people have been talking about this and writing about this and studying this for millennia. So the earliest dated conscious breathing practices date back, about 3,000, 4,000 years. And if you look around the world, all of these different cultures started studying the same things. They've started coming to the same conclusions about breathing, that if we do it improperly, our health is going to suffer. If we do it properly, we can really help use that to help heal ourselves and to go up that next rung of human potential. So the thing that was frustrating is we would discover these things, and then for some reason, in some way, they would be ignored and lost. Then they would be rediscovered, renamed something else, rediscovered by someone else at a different time, and then be proven at that time and forgotten about. And this just kept happening over and over and over. I guess the more accurate title would be Lost and Found, because that's what kept happening. And it really feels like right now we're at this moment where we have the instruments, we have the interest to really study breathing and to prove how it's working, how it alters our minds and our bodies, and how it can benefit us. And that would be the new science of that subtitle. It's a new science, new measurements, looking at a very old practice.
Yeah, it's interesting when you compare this to other old practices such as, let's say, traditional Chinese medicine, which for years has been telling us that different organs in the body function in different ways at different times of the day. Something that Western medicine until recently has almost sort of looked down upon. That was, the liver is the liver, the kidney is the kidney, but there's a lot of science now in circadian biology showing that these organs at different times in the day, there's different amounts of genetic expression and they have different functions, different enzymatic functioning and all kinds of things. Yet we need we've needed modern science now to go, oh, actually, yeah, you were right. And I sort of understand that. And you are a science journalist, so I guess you may, or is it fair to say you always approach topics with a bit of skepticism? Because I kind of feel that it's not a little bit of arrogance in us as modern humans that we sort of feel that, oh, prove it, prove it. Like you're saying this has been written about 5,000 years ago. So it's so striking that we've forgotten it. We need reminding of it. But then also, why is it at this moment in time, in 2020, why does it appear to be such an interest now in breathing and breathwork? Because yes, your book is incredible, but Wim Hof has been gaining notoriety and popularity for a good few years now. Hopefully Patrick McEwen, and with the oxygen advantage, that's getting more and more awareness. I mean, what is going on? Why are people interested now?
I think the main thing for me was I had no slant going into this story. There's no benefit for me to say nasal breathing is better than mouth breathing, or one version of breathing is better than the other. So my job as a journalist is to go in, talk to the experts in the field, accumulate as much information, and objectively come out and give my assessment of this world of breathing. So there was a lot of what I found which was not supported at all, but the areas that I focused on the book have such a firm foundation of science. And I think a lot of it has to do with the way that science is set up, especially medical science right now. At the beginning, about half of the professors and doctors and other experts I talked to said, breathing doesn't matter. So how we do it does not matter. Nose, mouth, 20 times a day, 10 times a day, your body is going to compensate, which is 100% true. Our bodies will compensate, but that doesn't mean they're fully working at their best potential. That doesn't mean we're healthy. Just getting by is different than being healthy. Then you have all these other researchers who have studied breathing for 50 years. Some of these researchers signed up for 50 years. They said, how we breathe absolutely affects us. It even affects the density of our bones. It affects us down to the atomic level, subatomic level with electrons. So to think that how we breathe does not matter is not based in any real science. And And again, my job was to go in and talk to these people and look at the studies and piece together a story from that.
Yeah. Now, thanks for sharing that. When I think about breathing and when I talk to people, whether it's my family, my friends, patients, I think people are starting to get awareness now that actually it's important. But there's a bit of confusion. There's so many different breathing methods out there. And I think some people struggle to know, well, what sort of breathing method should I do? I really want to sort of delve into that today in this conversation. But I guess before we do that, is it worth clarifying, what is the problem at the moment? Is there a base level breathing practice that everyone should do, for example? Because I think it'll be easy, and I want to go into all different kinds of breathing practices, but I also want to make sure we don't lose people so that they can see the big picture, but they also know a simple thing that they can take away and start applying.
Yeah, and that's a great question, and it's a question I had early on, because you've got dozens of books on breathing. There's some books on pranayama that have 300 different practices in it. It's like, where do I begin here? What I found is so many of them all come to the same conclusion. They're all doing the same thing. So they're means to the same ends. So if you look at ancient Chinese practices of breathing, they are almost identical to ancient Hindu practices of breathing, which are almost identical to the yoga practices that are being used now, or the other practices that are being used by psychiatrists for anxiety and depression. They're all doing the same thing. We know this from measurements. So what I tried to do in the book was not to focus on these individual breathing techniques, but to focus on the larger story around it. How do they affect us? What are they? Where did they come from? Because it doesn't matter. You could call it by 12 different names. Slow breathing is slow breathing. And there's a very simple way of doing it. So the center of the book is a foundation of breathing that everybody can benefit from. And again, it doesn't matter who invented this or who claims to have invented this stuff or at what time. It's simple practices of breathing through the nose, exhaling more, breathing less, breathing slowly. So that's what I tried to focus on, the general view of this. And if you want more of the specifics, there's already a zillion books on the how-to with hundreds of different practices.
You're just past 8 a.m. at the moment in San Francisco. So I don't know what your normal wake-up time is, but have you done any breath work this morning as a way of preparing for the day ahead?
I'm a night owl, so my normal wake-up time is much later than this, hence the tea over here.
Oh, wow.
But, people think that since I studied breathing for so many years, I'd be the best breather in the world, and I'm not. I've got a lot of work to do. But at least the first step about breathing is to be conscious of it and to understand that this isn't something that should just be running in the background, in the back of our minds, but something that we can take control of. So I'm acutely aware of when I'm breathing improperly, and I'm acutely aware of then how to fix it. So more intense breath work practices I will do about 3 or 4 times a week, usually at night. But throughout the day, I'm adopting very simple, healthy breathing habits. And that to me is one of the most important things about this. This isn't asking people to go out and run 6 miles a day or to completely change their lifestyle. You can adopt healthy breathing habits no matter what you're doing. If you're sitting in front of a computer, if you're watching Netflix, if you're walking around. And just by adopting those, you can have a transformative effect on your health. That sounds like a huge claim, but I've seen it and the studies have shown it.
Yeah, brilliant. I think that's a great message for people. So let's dive into something that you have written about. You've touched on it in the conversation so far, nasal breathing, okay? And, for people who've been listening to my podcast for a while, they will have heard me talk about this with Brian McKenzie and with Patrick McEwen, right? But I think we've got a lot of new listeners, and I think it's always reiterating how important it is to breathe through your nose. So what's going on? When someone breathes through their nose compared to their mouth, what is going on and why does it make such a difference?
So when we breathe through our nose, we are humidifying air, we're pressurizing air, we are filtering that air out, and we're conditioning it so that by the time that air gets to our lungs, it can more easily be absorbed and we can extract oxygen from it. So we know this. This has been proven time and time again. And yet about 25 to 50% of the population habitually mouth breathes. And when you mouth breathe, you get none of those benefits. You can almost think of the lungs as an external organ when you're mouth breathing, right? They're exposed to everything in your environment. And if you live in a city like I do, I don't want to expose my lungs to all those allergens and pollutants. So the quickest way of filtering air and conditioning it is this wondrous organ right in the front of our faces called the nose. And it is completely underappreciated and underused in society.
Yeah, absolutely. So how did you go from, I think I've read you say before, or I think maybe I heard it in an interview, that you used to be a mouth breather. How did you become a nose breather? And is it possible for anyone to actually listen to this and go, okay, I hear you, James, there's all these benefits. I want those benefits. How do I start?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I remember breathing through my mouth as a kid. I see pictures of myself when I was young and I'm breathing through my mouth. Not all the time, but it definitely happened. And even until adulthood, I thought it was normal just to go to sleep with a pint of water by my bed every single night, to wake up every few hours with a dry mouth, take a swig of water, go back to sleep. I did that for decades till I met Dr. Nyack down at Stanford. And he said, this isn't normal at all. We should be breathing through our nose all the time, especially during sleeping hours. That's a third of your life. And if you're breathing through the mouth, you're just exposing yourself to everything in your environment. And also you're loosening the tissues at the back of your throat and making yourself more apt to snore and have sleep apnea, which is another thing that blew my mind. So, once you realize how dangerous mouth breathing is, you can then take a conscious effort to change it, how you're breathing throughout the day. But that won't help you when you're unconscious at night, right? So once I learned this, I was shutting my mouth all the time, practicing nasal breathing. At the beginning, it was very difficult. I felt very congested here. But the nose is a use it or lose it organ. I also learned that from Stanford, that the more you use it, the more it's going to open up. Those tissues are going to acclimate and open up. So I focused on that. And at night, this sounds a little crazy, but I used a little piece of tape, which I still do, just on my lips to train my mouth shut at night. And this sounds a little, like new age science, but it's not, because I heard from a breathing therapist at Stanford, Ann Kearney, who had used it herself and uses it for her patients. I talked to other researchers who did the same thing. And that has helped me tremendously. And it's helped so many other people as well. And it's free.
Yeah. Hey, James, look, I'm totally with you on that. It is incredible, the difference. In fact, I actually spoke to a buddy this morning on the phone who I've not spoken to for a few months. And I said, hey, he was saying, how's the podcast going? I said, yeah, great. I'm actually speaking to someone, James Nestor, this afternoon. You've got to get his book. It's just incredible. It's all about breathing. And he said to me that the thing he's changed a few months ago was he started to tape his mouth up at night. And he said he cannot believe the difference. He said, I don't wake up thirsty. I'm not groggy in the morning. I've got more energy, better cognition, And I think for people who are skeptical, and I know they are out there, they're even within my own family, they're skeptics to how important breathing is. I think it really is quite profound what you can feel like. You may not even know how good you can feel until you start breathing in a more optimal way. But when you talk about tape over your mouth, some people, I think, will probably feel claustrophobic in the thought of actually taping their mouth shut. Probably is going to scare them, but you would say it's not like that, is it?
No, and just to second what you were saying, it's one thing to have a subjective experience and say, hey, I feel better after taping, and that means something, right? But it's another thing to measure this stuff. If we can measure it, we can study it. If we can study it, we can figure out if it's actually working. And that's exactly what we did, working with NIAC at Stanford. So the measurements from these instruments aren't going to lie. Yes, I felt better, but to me, as a science journalist, it's much more convincing to have data, because what works with one person may not work with somebody else. And they're finding right now that Stanford and Kearney is booting up a study of 200 people looking at sleep apnea and snoring and sleep tape. And I so happen to have a little role here. And I want to explain to people that I would highly suggest not going on YouTube and looking how to sleep tape, because there's a lot of really sketchy stuff there. All you need is a teeny piece of tape. I use a piece that big. It's about half the size of a postage stamp. And I put it right across my lips. I can still talk to you. I can still breathe from my mouth if I want, but it just reminds me when I'm unconscious to keep my jaw shut, and I can take it off with my tongue. So this is not a hostage situation, duct tape kind of thing. This is a teeny piece of tape just to train the mouth shut. And just anecdotally, I've received several dozen emails from people who have had chronic snoring for the past few decades, who have had even mild or moderate sleep apnea, and they've recorded their sleep and they no longer suffer from those things. So that's not psychosomatic. It's not a placebo effect. That's what happens when you close your mouth and you allow that air to be pressurized, push the soft tissues further back in your airway and open them up to breathe more efficiently. You get 20% more oxygen through a nasal breath than you do through a mouth breath. And if you think that's not going to affect you over the long term, you're nuts. It will have a tremendous effect on your health.
Yeah, absolutely. In your research, you mentioned sleep apnea, and these problems we have. Sleep problems are endemic now. Sleep deprivation is an epidemic. There's many reasons for that, of course. But it's really fascinating for me that, I think back, I always try and look at the way we're suffering now, or the maladies of the 21st century, and try and put them in an evolutionary perspective, in a context to go, what's really going on here? And I don't know if in your research, did you ever come across that sleep apnea and sleep problems are quite a modern problem? I mean, do we know if this existed 300-400 years ago? Was any part of your research on this at all?
Well, we can't go back and test people, but what we can do is look at skeletons. And so I talked to the experts in the field, biological anthropologists, who look at the shape of skeletons. And our ancestors, anything older than around 400 years, maybe 500 years, they would have these very powerful jaws, and they would have these faces that grew outward and these huge nasal apertures in the back. So from those skeletons, we can decipher that these people had larger airways. They had more room to breathe. We know that obesity absolutely affects snoring and sleep apnea as well. And people were not as obese as they are now. And that seems very clear and understood. But this idea that our ancestors had these huge, powerful faces and we do not is less acknowledged. And yet it's very clear in the skeletal record. And an example of this is looking at the teeth of an ancient skeleton. If you were to look at the teeth of one of your ancestors, 400 years old, 4,000 years old, 40,000, doesn't matter, on back, they would have perfectly straight teeth. There's like a 99.9% chance perfectly straight teeth. Today, 90% of us have some sort of crookedness in our teeth because our mouths have grown so small. With a very small mouth, you also have a smaller airway. And that's one of the main reasons so many of us suffer from snoring, sleep apnea, respiratory problems. It's even implicated in asthma, allergies, and more.
Yeah, wow. And why do we think that's happened? Why have we got such a smaller mouth, smaller jaw? There's some sort of theories out there?
Yeah, there's a few theories, but there's also a few absolute facts that have been very clearly identified in the past 20 years. And that is when our food shifted from this wild, tough food where we were required to chew a lot more. Food became soft, we chewed less, our mouths grew too small. Environmental inputs had some effect on that. When you're walking around breathing through your mouth, especially when you're a kid, your face will grow differently. It's so common that this is called adenoid face, from when the adenoids or tonsils inflame and you have to walk around like this. But most of it is caused by food, by the softness of our diets. And there's been some incredible research done in this. And I just think it's so under acknowledged, the role that chewing, masticatory stress, plays in the structure of our faces. But it's also so simple. The less you use something, the less it's going to develop. And especially, this is important in infancy. They've done studies where they've looked at infants who have been bottle fed versus those who have been breastfed. And when an infant is breastfed, it requires a tremendous amount of stress and exercise and helps push the face outward, which will then create a larger airway.
Yeah. You know, it's incredible. You're talking about food that we chew more. What you're fundamentally talking about is more natural foods, less highly processed, industrialized foods. So we often think about food in the context of our health, our well-being, particularly a lot of people talk about it in the context of their weight. But you're sort of saying, yeah, sure, but what, you know, yes, your weight, but health and well-being is so broad. And now we're introducing mouth size and teeth strength and teeth structure and jaw structure into the potential benefits of eating real food.
Yeah, and here again is an example of all these disparate people in these disparate areas of science all coming to the same general conclusion in just slightly different ways. So we're usually looking at foods in terms of calories, at least in the US, we're looking at it in terms of calories. We're not looking at it in terms of toughness or softness. And I think it's quite interesting that even today, you think about what's considered healthy food today: oatmeal, avocados, yogurt, you know, goo bars. All this stuff is soft. It requires basically no chewing at all. And the less you're chewing, especially when you're younger, the less you'll be working out these muscles, the less you'll be developing your face.
Yeah, and you said especially when you're younger. Now that's really interesting, because one thing, yes, as a doctor, but also as a parent, that I've always found quite curious is this idea that, oh, the adults will eat proper food, but the kids menu, I don't know if it's the same in the States, the kids menu is generally full of junk. It's like the adults will order the proper food, but the kids will have some sort of, I don't know, you know, hyper-processed, industrialized foods. And, you know, I am not blaming anyone or criticizing anyone for doing that. I understand that's almost the conditioning as well. But one thing we have very much tried hard from a young age with our children is they eat the same as what we do. We eat as much as we can, minimally processed, you know, food as close to nature as possible. And, you know, I appreciate we're lucky to be able to have access to that, but we do that, and that's what we give our kids. We don't make separate food for them. And it's just interesting, you know, you say all roads are sort of leading to Rome in the same place. Actually, yeah, eat the right diet. It's almost like, it's basically what you're trying to say is live, eat, and breathe in the way that we have evolved to, and we will be more thriving, healthier, happier human beings, I guess.
Yeah, nature already did all of this for us. It's just in the last 100 years, we thought that we were smarter than nature, and we thought we could take some sidetracks into this and condense food down to one pill or some mush that you could squirt into your mouth and it would have the same effect. Yeah, we're not getting scurvy from that or beriberi from that. We're not getting these diseases that we used to suffer from, but we're also denying ourselves so many of the benefits. And exactly what you had said, and there's this huge, I would even call it a revolution right now in baby-led weaning, which is not to give babies, infants, this soft mush in jars which we've only been doing for the past 100 years anyway. And look at what's happened. Look at what's happened to our weight. Look at what's happened to our faces. Look at what happened to our teeth. I mean, on and on and on. That is a modern invention. So to allow kids, especially early on, to be able to really work out that masticatory stress, to chew properly, is going to have benefits down the road. And that's been very well proven at this time.
Yeah, and it really, you know, the phrase use it or lose it, which is common parlance in the English language, both in the US and in the UK. You know, we understand that, don't we, with muscles? We get that. You know, if I do a bicep curl every morning, my bicep is going to get stronger. If I stop doing it, over time, it's going to get smaller. I think we understand that with our physical muscles. But as you say, I don't think we've thought about it in terms of our jaw, our mastication muscles. It's like if you don't chew regularly, if you're not sort of having that stress put on your jaw, like the stress on the bicep, well, your jaw is then going to adapt, isn't it? It's going to adapt to what it feels that you need. I think I've heard you mention before that there's something about chewing on one side as opposed to two sides, and I found that really interesting. So I'd love to just explore that, but I also just want to make sure we've covered that many people listen to this show. Some, I'm sure, are avid meat eaters. Some are vegans. And when we talk about natural food, I think it's just important to say you can probably, whilst obviously meat is quite tough and there's bones to chew on, there's a lot of vegetables like carrots, for example, or a lot of tough veg that you have to chew. You can probably also get that sort of stress on the jaw, right? So I just want to make sure we include everyone in this conversation, that they all feel as though this applies to them. So I wonder if you could just expand on that at all.
Means to the same ends. That's again, you've got these different people in these different camps, but of course, if you're chewing on carrots, if you're chewing on celery, I mean, just think of natural foods. Even wheat, we got really good at removing the bran and the germ from wheat and creating this processed white flour. And the same thing with rice, white rice, bran and germ removed. We just have this little seed left. So chewing is essential, especially early on, to developing proper airway health, proper mouth. We know that, and it's how you chew, what you're chewing is. I don't want to get into that. That gets very, very political, because the carnivores are going to say one thing, vegans are going to say the other. But do not underestimate the power and benefits of chewing. And this is a whole new science that is really being deeply explored now, which I find is fascinating.
Sorry to interrupt. If you're enjoying this conversation, there's loads more like it on my channel. Please do press subscribe and hit that bell. Now, back to the conversation. You've had so many emails and so much feedback. You've mentioned that mouth taping at night is something that comes up regularly. What are some of the other things that come up where people have fed back to you that, I tried this, James, and actually this has now got better, etc., etc.?
Well, a lot of people have written and said that they are so grateful for having this information, but behind their thankfulness, there's an irritation and a frustration that it took them reading a book to learn about these things, to learn how asthma can be significantly reduced. It can even be reversed by taking control of your breathing. And if you don't believe me, all you have to do is look at the dozens and dozens and dozens of scientific studies that have proven this, or talk to Patrick McEwen, whom I know was on your show. This guy's, for 20 years, he's been teaching people how to reverse their asthma. So I think that some of this is due to, again, all of the noise. It has to do with the internet. Everyone's got a voice now, which is great, but it's also problematic, as we're seeing. And it took, I guess, someone to go in objectively and to really look at this stuff and to look at what had worked and to talk to the people on, again, both sides. So I think that this knowledge is obviously a great thing. And that's the only thing that we really have right now that the internet can provide is knowledge. People have access to information they would not have access to 20 years ago through podcasts like yours, through books. And I think that through that knowledge, people are becoming empowered to start to take control of their health in different ways, and to listen to experts who have years and years of experience actually helping people, not just conducting studies, but helping people day in and day out. And I think that that information and those perspectives are really the most valuable.
It's interesting that there's an anger and a frustration coming through, and I can see why there would be an anger, because if you can reduce how much you're taking your inhaler, let's say for asthma, if you can reduce your anxiety or even eliminate your anxiety by working on some breathing practices, you may well be thinking, well, why the hell have I not heard about this before when I've been to my doctor or my healthcare professional? So I understand that anger. I really do.
Well, a lot of it comes to the capacity that healthcare professionals have with their patients. There's doctors in my family. We talk about this stuff all the time. And they're dealing with acute, often serious problems. So if I get in a car accident, the last thing I want is breathing practices. I want surgery. I want the latest in Western technology to help sew me up. But the people who have been left out in the cold are the people with these milder chronic issues. It's only when these milder chronic issues becomes really serious that people get treatment. But oftentimes that's too late. And I heard this so many times through so many researchers and so many doctors over the years, and I'm still hearing it all the time. And there was a quote that actually Brian McKenzie told me, which I thought was great, is Eastern medicine is great if you want to live. Western medicine is great if you don't want to die. So there's a big difference in those two things. And I think that they both have enormous benefits, but we shouldn't be thinking that you have to pick one or the other. And I think that's where it gets really problematic. If you have a very serious disease and Western medicine can help you, why on earth wouldn't you help yourself through that? So it's about integrating these two things and knowing when to say when to each of them, which I think is really the key. And if you look at the top medical institutions in the world right now, this is the direction everything's going in, from Harvard to Stanford, to Yale, to Oxford, and that's inspiring. It's taking a while to get there, but these scientific revolutions can take decades.
I love that quote that Brian shared with you. It's really made me think, but it's spot on. Certainly in my 20 years experience of seeing patients, I'd have to say that is completely spot on. I recognize maybe 5 years in that actually, you know what, we're really good at acutes. We're just not as good with this sort of chronic stuff a lot of the time. And I'm very proud to be a doctor, but I think we should be honest and say, well, these tools are great, but actually we're a bit limited. Can we get a bigger toolbox in certain areas? One of the sort of modern voices who has really helped to elevate breath work is Wim Hof. And, I want to talk about Wim's methods and some of the pros and the potential cons that some people talk about with those sort of hyperventilation type breaths. I think that's going to be really important. But I wanted to ask you, James, I talk about breathwork a lot, and what I hear is there's a lot of confusion. There's a lot of confusion that, I thought we need to breathe less, but now you're saying to breathe 30 times and then hold my breath with the Wim Hof method. And I wonder if you could sort of unpick that for people. What are the broad principles of these different breathing techniques, and when and how should people think about bringing them into their lives?
So I was as confused as anyone when I was researching this book and learned this exact thing. And when you start investigating different breathing methods, there are different breathing philosophies and different breathing camps. So the Buteyko people will say, you only breathe very slowly. You only breathe through your nose. You never want to overbreathe. And the Wim Hof people, including Wim himself, says, no, breathe, everybody, breathe, go, go, go. So who's right? And they're both right, is what I learned. It just depends on what you want to get out of your breath. So for the majority of the time, you do want to breathe slowly, rhythmically, lightly through the nose, okay? That is how you're going to get the most oxygen, the most energy for the least effort. And that's exactly what you want throughout the day. But sometimes you want to push your breath and you want to use it to purposely stress your body out. A lot of you may be thinking, why do I ever want to stress my body out? Right? I'm stressed throughout the day. I'm answering emails, dealing with calls, dealing with the kids, exercising. But that's exactly why you should use breathing to stress your body out, because what these practices do is they focus that stress into a controlled space in your day. So the Wim Hof method, you're not going to do that all day. Just like you wouldn't be going to the gym and lifting weights all day. It would destroy your body. Wim's method, you do it for about 20 minutes. And the point is that you use this method to purposely stress your body out so that the other 23 and a half hours of the day, you can be in a state of calm and control. And, you know, Wim calls it the Wim Hof method, but he's so clear that these practices have been around thousands and thousands of years. You can call it Tumo, you can call it Sudarshan Kriya, you can call it pranayama, whatever. They're all doing the same thing. They're forcing you to overbreathe, to stress yourself out, then control your breath, and then to stress yourself out again, then control it again, like interval training, so that you can control your stress. And the science is very clear that these methods can have an incredible impact on both mental health and physical health, including autoimmune diseases.
One of the most memorable bits in your book for me was when you were talking about your own experience of trying Tumo breathing. And you said something to the effect of, I was stressing my body out, but this stress felt very different to the stress that I feel when I'm running late for an important meeting. And I thought that was really fascinating, this idea of stress, which we typically associate as being a bad thing. Certainly the societal narrative around stress is bad, we want to avoid it. But that was a beautiful way of describing sort of helpful stress and unhelpful stress. And I wonder if you could expand on that a little bit.
I think the difference is when you are rushing to a meeting, when you are trying to answer emails and trying to answer calls and getting very frustrated with the amount of work you have to do every day, there's no outlet for that stress. That stress seems to build and build and build, and it starts coming out in different ways. You get angry, you can't think straight, your blood pressure goes up, you start clenching your fists or your muscles tighten, and that's such bad news. But if you clench your fist and tighten your muscles and control your breath and learn to do this consciously, you can learn what that stress feels like, and you can then learn to turn it off. So a lot of these practices have you do that. Wim has, you're holding your breath and then you're breathing as hard as you can, and then you're holding your breath again and taking one breath and then exhaling it. So this is stressful to the body. But what the body doesn't want is to be in these states of low-grade stress throughout the day and throughout the night. Periodic stress is very good, okay? Hermetic stress is very good for the body. That's how we evolved, to go and run after a tiger or fight off someone, and then to chill out for the rest of the day and the rest of the night. What's happening now is so many of us are staying in this chronic state of stress. It's like this IV drip of stress throughout the day. And you can see that in what this has done to our health. So inflammation is behind the vast majority of modern chronic diseases, whether you're looking at diabetes or heart disease or hypertension or whatever. And so this inflammation is exacerbated by this constant low-grade stress, whether that stress is coming from the foods you're eating, whether it's coming from the environment. So it's no coincidence that hunter-gatherer populations don't have any of these modern diseases that we have. It's no coincidence that our ancestors, as far as we can see, didn't have the vast majority of these diseases we have today either. So that's a long way of saying that controlling the stress and using breathing as your pressure release valve can have enormous benefits to your day-to-day health.
We're living in incredibly stressful times at the moment. The world has significantly changed the way people live over the last 12, 15, 16 months or so. And stress, anxiety has ramped up in many ways for so many people. One thing I don't think people still quite fully understand is how intimately our stress levels are linked with the way that we breathe. And therefore, without that understanding, it's hard sometimes to persuade people that, hey, you know what, if you literally can hack that system by working on your breath, not for hours a day, just a few simple things, you can actually start to change your biology. So can you speak a little bit to how stress and breath are linked?
Well, this is what's so great about breathing is you can feel the effects and you can see the effects immediately. When you're changing your diet, usually that takes a little while, right? To really see the transformative effects it has to eat a healthy diet. It'll take maybe a few days, but if you want to lose weight, it's going to take a few weeks or it's going to take a few months. And, so many of us today, we have a very short attention span. So I think that's one reason people fall off their diets. They're just like, I'm sick of doing this. But with breathing, one of my favorite things to do is to put a pulse oximeter on someone, put a heart rate variability monitor on someone, have them breathe in a very specific way, and then watch what happens after a minute, right? Even after a few seconds, you can see this transformation taking place in your body. You can watch your blood pressure go down 10 or 15 points. I've seen mine even go down 20 points if I went from a state of being stressed to controlling my breathing and de-stressing myself through those means. So I think that's what's been so convincing with a lot of the readers of the book and also to myself is if you're able to improve your health and improve the efficiency of your body within a few minutes, just imagine what's going to happen after a few days or a few weeks or a few months. And you start to understand how your breathing is such an integral part of your healing and your long-term health. So I could get into the biochemical processes of it, but that's the umbrella, right? That's the overview of what these things are doing. And again, if there are skeptics out there, and I hope there are, question what I'm saying, but then go and grab some of these monitors and breathe in a certain way and tell me what happens to your body and what happens to your brain. Because what's happening in the body as well is happening in the brain. EEG patterns transform when we start breathing in a slow, rhythmic way. Different areas of the brain start coming online. You're able to think more clearly because you're allowing your brain to function at peak efficiency.
And we feel free to expand on the biochemistry because, in that section where you were talking about your own experience with Tumo breathing, you also had this gorgeous phrase that it was as if Tumo opened up your own body's pharmacy. And that stuck with me. I thought we've got these chemicals inside us already, but it seems as though certain breath practices can sort of unlock like that full potential that we're sort of maybe keeping suppressed because of the way we're breathing and the way we're living our daily lives.
Well, this is what's been so fascinating and great to see about what Wim has been doing. So he's had so many skeptics too over the last 20 years. He said, okay, be skeptical. Just take me into your lab and I'll do whatever. You can shoot me up with E. coli. Sure. Sounds great. You can take blood work at various levels while I breathe. We can bring in some other people. You can take their blood work and see what happens. And that's what he's shown. We've known this for a long time, that breathing in certain ways will create and trigger these responses in your body to release hormones, to release stress hormones, to release relaxing hormones, to open up the blood vessels. We already know all that, but I think that such a superhuman breather as Wim is, he's able to show the true potential of where breathing can take us. So I think that what he has shown is this stressful breathing can help the body better defend itself. It can bolster the immune function, which is why Wim Hof breathing has been shown to be so effective for some people with autoimmune diseases. their immune systems have gone rampant. They're attacking healthy tissues in the body. That helps to reverse that. But we can also use breathing to release different feel-good hormones. And when we do that, we can trigger those releases at any time. And this is one of the reasons that I think Wim Hof breathing has become so popular, because it's so hard not to feel amazing at the end of that breathing session. If anyone out there has done it, it's hard to see someone who hasn't had a very profound reaction after 20 minutes says, wow, I feel so good. You feel that good because you're triggering the release of these hormones in your body. And that's what's, to me, is allows people to keep coming back to this and to keep using it, because you're creating a positive feedback loop to allow yourself to heal, and also to allow your monkey mind to be entertained by the constant good feelings, right? The constant, sometimes hallucinations that some of these breath work practices bring on. And it's great. I love the Wim Hof method. I do it as often as I can, which is usually a couple times a week. I also love Kundalini. I also love Sudarshan Kriya. But all of these things are essentially doing the same thing to your body and brain.
Some people say that in a society full of stress, full of adrenaline already, that these hyperventilation practices like Tumo, like the Wim Hof method, are not necessarily the best choices. So I wonder what you would say to that. Could this potentially be the wrong method for some people?
To me, it's just another option. It's just another tool you have in your back pocket. So people are going to want to come to breathing for different reasons. And there is no overarching prescription that you can use to cure everyone's woes. There is a foundation of healthy breathing that I tried to establish in the book. Said, okay, I don't care if you're an ultra marathoner or an asthmatic or have long haul COVID or are just anxious. Here are some breathing practices that will help everybody. And there are zero side effects to this, right? You're only going to feel better. You're only going to be able to perform better. It's just like with food. We know that eating a healthy diet benefits everybody. But when you get into more specific chronic conditions, you're absolutely right. Some people with panic and anxiety would hate Wim Hof breathing, and they'd hate Sudarshan Kriya, because these incorporate states of extreme hyperventilation, and that's going to give them a lot of trouble. So with people like that, I would say start slow, right? Start with that 5.5 seconds in, 5.5 seconds out. That's even too much for a lot of people. So it's so important not to try to go and kick your breathing's butt, and this is what Westerners tend to do with everything, but to really dip into it slowly and become immersed into it at your body and your mind's own level of comfort. And so with people with anxiety and with people with asthma and panic, what I've tried to tell them is go very slowly. Start with 3 seconds in, 3 seconds out. And you would be amazed how few people have actually breathed in that way. Just 3 seconds in, 3 seconds out. Get comfortable with that and extend it. So if you're talking about someone who is already an extreme biohacker, you know, they're in constant ketosis and they're eating all the right stuff and taking all the right pills and potions, and they just want to totally push it, go big then. Go do the Wim Hof method. Go try holotropic breath work. That'll really send you on a whirl. And those people are already prepared, right? They're conditioned to do this. It's the same reason why you wouldn't say to somebody who's been sitting on a couch for the past year, go and run a marathon, because it's going to be really good for your body. You have to do what your body is telling you to do, and to listen to your body and go into this stuff slowly.
One of the things that I love personally with breath work, and that I've seen so impactful with hundreds, if not thousands of my patients, is that tuning into your breath tunes you into your body, right? You start to gain an awareness that often people have never had, or certainly for many, many years, just to stop, quieten the noise and actually listen to certain things. Like, I'm interested as to what practices you do on a daily basis, if any. What I do, I usually tape my mouth at night, but I also love doing breath holds when I'm walking. And I know you have written about this in your book, but when I'm out for a walk, after about 5 or 10 minutes, I will do, I will be breathing through my nose. I'll breathe out. I'll sort of breathe out a normal exhale, and then I'll see how far I can walk until I get that sort of medium air hunger. And then I'll do that 5 or 10 times. And what I love about that is, I can see myself getting better. So my body is better able to tolerate that carbon dioxide buildup compared to, let's say, 2 years ago. So that's really great to see. But also, if I haven't slept well, or if I'm quite stressed and tense with work pressures and deadlines, I find I can't hold my breath as long. And it's almost like a early warning sign for me as to sort of what else is going on in my body. So that's one thing I love, and I would really encourage people to get into some form of breath work, because I think it kind of teaches you about yourself and your state of stress.
So breath holding has been a part of every breathing practice for thousands and thousands of years. Ancient Hindus were talking about breath holding, 3,000, 4,000 years ago. The ancient Chinese were saying the exact same thing, same exact practice, different culture. Were they talking to one another then? I don't think so. And yet they came to the same conclusions. So to me, it's no coincidence that now modern science is really catching up to what our ancestors have been saying for so long. And we know that CO2 tolerance plays a huge role in panic, in asthma, in anxiety. We know that because the studies have shown very clearly that people who can't hold their breath for a very long time are much more susceptible to suffer from these conditions. I thought that this was fascinating. I went out to the Laureate Institute of Brain Research and met with Dr. Justin Feinstein, who is a neuropsychologist out there doing CO2 work. And he's one of the only researchers I found doing work into this thing called CO2 and CO2 tolerance. And he had a huge NIH study looking at CO2 tolerance and panic. And he's the one who told me that so many of his patients over the years, he would ask them just to sit down, and before he hooked them up to any monitors, he'd ask them just to take a sip of air and hold their breath. And this is what they did. Then he'd ask them to do it again. Usually they'd last about 2 seconds, 3 seconds. And you see this all the time with asthmatics and with people suffering from even anorexia and other fear-based disorders. So he kept wondering if you could allow them to tolerate more CO2 if it would allow them to better control their condition, because so much of their condition was caused by this perpetual hyperventilation. They were so scared of holding their breath because a breath hold to them reminded them of a panic attack or an asthma attack or an anxiety attack, that they had conditioned themselves to breathe like this all the time. And this wasn't just a few people either. This is so common in communities of people who have those issues. So he has continued doing this research. And what I thought was even more fascinating is he's not the one who invented this stuff. You can look back more than 100 years and see researchers at Yale, and Harvard, and Boston University, and University of Wisconsin doing work in CO2 and mental health conditions. And this stuff worked incredibly well, not just breathing retraining, but actually having these people inhale a bit of CO2. And what does that do? It replicates holding your breath. That's what it does, because when you hold your breath, your CO2 increases. These people can hold their breath, so they allowed them to celebrate in the benefits of breath holding by giving them a mouthful of CO2. So I just kept finding these stories over and over again where we had learned this. It had been studied at the most prestigious medical institutions and proven to be incredibly effective. And then we had forgotten it. And now a few people are remembering it right now. And that's what's been exciting since the book has come out, is there seems to be a lot more interest in CO2 and CO2 tolerance, both in athletes and in people who are looking to overcome mental health issues.
Yeah, I mean, just a recap for people, if they didn't hear our first conversation, if they're not familiar, that drive to breathe doesn't come from our oxygen levels dropping. It comes from our carbon dioxide levels building up. And if we can't tolerate that, we have to breathe, right? So, you know, this CO2, the carbon dioxide training that you're talking about can have, I could just see physiologically how many different conditions that could immediately have an impact on, particularly anxiety. You can really see how it would help people. You mentioned athletics, and I know you've written and spoken about, I think was it the 1968 men's track and field team, and you know, tell us a little bit about that and how athletes and fitness enthusiasts can use sort of breath holding and nasal breathing and all kinds of methods to actually improve their performance.
Well, again, these were methods that have been used for decades and decades, but kind of became less popular for some reason in the last few decades. But one story in particular, which I thought was so interesting, was Carl Stau's work looking at a long exhale. So he was a choral conductor, and he found that so many of his singers were breathing these very shallow breaths. And when you breathe very shallowly, you don't have the resonance and you can't carry a note for as long. So he started training them to exhale longer. And how our breath comes into our bodies, the lungs just don't inflate on their own, right? They need something to do this. They're just like two balloons. But we have something called a diaphragm underneath the lungs. And when we breathe in, that diaphragm lowers. And when we breathe out, that diaphragm lifts up. So Stau found that even within his singers, they had such limited range of their diaphragms. And by extending the range of their diaphragms, they allowed themselves more lung capacity. And they could sing so much better. So he ended up going and retraining singers at the Met Opera, who were already pretty good singers to begin with, but they were even better after he taught them these new tricks. And he got so popular that VA hospitals on the East Coast asked him to come in and help people with emphysema, who were basically put on gurneys with an oxygen cannula up to their noses and fed a steady diet of antibiotics and left in the hospital to die. Nobody had any idea what to do with these people. Emphysemics lose the ability to engage their diaphragm. Parts of their lungs get inflamed and destroyed by emphysema. Those parts don't grow back, but if you engage more of your diaphragm, you can use the rest of the lung to compensate. So Stau was able to take these people who were literally left for dead, retrain them only in breathing. That's the only thing he did. And these people got up and left the hospital and went to live normal lives. And there's x-rays of this. There's data sheets of it. I have even heard from a few of these patients whom Stau treated, and they said he absolutely saved their lives. So that's a very long way of saying Stau then got even more popular that he was asked by the Olympic Committee for the U.S. to come and retrain the runners for the Mexico City Olympics. And he used the exact same methods, engaging more diaphragmatic movement. And these runners went to Mexico City, which has an elevation of like 6,000 or 7,000 feet. And they were the only team not to use oxygen before and after, and they destroyed everybody. It's still the greatest performance of any track team in the history of the Olympics. And they were able to do this because they knew how to breathe properly. So a lot of trainers, Patrick McEwen being one, Brian McKenzie being the other, they have adopted these same tricks, and they're using them to create these absolute monster of athletes right now. Yeah. These people who are just really outperforming anything they were able to do before.
If you enjoyed that conversation, I think you are really going to enjoy the one I had with the former monk, Jay Shetty, on the simple things that you can do to train your mind. It's right there. Give it a listen and let me know what you think.
The monk mindset is about pursuing your truest goals, your truest self, and your most authentic, aligned goals.